The tower shouldn't have been on. I checked the breakers, pulled the main fuse, and locked the gear cabinet myself. There hasn't been a working bulb in that lantern room since the Coast Guard decommissioned it in the 90s. But as I pulled my boat away from the reef, a yellow beam cut through the rain, tracking me, pinning me to the deck like it was looking for something. Then the light started to pulse, a deep, wet red that looked like it was breathing. If the tower is empty, what exactly is still burning? Story 1, The Keeper in the Lens. I was hired to clean the Fresnel lens at Blackwood Light. It's a massive piece of glass, over 6 feet tall, thousands of prisms designed to throw light for 20 miles across the Atlantic. It's beautiful in a cold, mechanical sort of way, but when you're standing inside that lantern room, the silence is heavy. It's just you and the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the rotation gears. I'm used to isolation. I've worked on cell towers in the middle of the desert and oil rigs in the Gulf. I know how to keep my head down and do the work. I was on my second day, polishing the inner glass of the third-order prisms. The sun was starting to dip, and the light was hitting the glass at an angle that turned the whole room into a kaleidoscope of refracted gold. That's when I saw him. In the reflection of the prisms, there was a man standing directly behind me. He was wearing an old-style heavy wool coat and a peaked cap, the kind keepers wore in the early 1900s. He wasn't moving. He was just staring at the back of my head. I didn't panic. I just assumed the site manager had sent someone up to check on my progress. I turned around to ask him how he got past the locked hatch on the 4th floor, but the room was empty. It was just me and the rotation gears. I walked to the edge of the gallery, looking down the spiral stairs. I checked the winch room, the oil locker, and even the tiny sleeping quarters. Everything was exactly as I had left it, dead silent and locked tight. When I went back to the lens, he was still there in the glass, but he wasn't standing behind me anymore. He was closer. He was standing right over my shoulder, so close I should have been able to feel the heat coming off his body. But the air in the room was freezing. In the reflection, he was pointing. His finger was pressed against the inside of a prism, pointing down at the base of the tower where the jagged rocks meet the tide. I leaned in, trying to see if it was some kind of trick of the light or a flaw in the old glass. That's when I noticed the impossible detail. In the reflection, his heavy wool coat was soaked. I could see the seawater dripping off the hem of his jacket, pooling on the floor behind me. I could see the salt crusting on his collar. But when I looked at the floor beneath my actual feet, it was bone dry. There was no water, no puddles, no sound of dripping. I watched the reflection as his blue, bloated finger tapped against the glass. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the water rising outside the tower. I looked at the reflection of my own hand, then at his. His skin had that translucent, waxy look of someone who's been submerged for weeks. I stopped cleaning the lens after that. I packed my gear and left the tower while the sun was still up. I don't care if the glass is smudged or if the beacon is dim. I don't want to see what he's pointing at when the tide finally reaches the gallery level. If the room is sealed and the heaters are running, why were his clothes dripping in the reflection? Why did I find a single wet barnacle sitting on the dry floor right where he was standing? Story 2, The 3 AM Foghorn. The foghorn at Sentinel Shoal wasn't supposed to work. It's a massive dual-tone diaphone system from the 1940s, 2 giant brass trumpets that used to be powered by massive air compressors in the basement. When the Coast Guard automated the station, they cut the lines and drained the tanks. The brass is green with salt corrosion, and the pistons are rusted solid. There is no air, no power, and no mechanical way for those horns to produce a sound. But every night for the last 2 weeks, exactly at 3 in the morning, the ground beneath the keeper's house begins to shake. I'm a preservationist, sent out to Sentinel Shoal to archive the old equipment before the tower is completely gutted. I'm a man of facts and mechanical blueprints. I don't believe in ghost stories, and I certainly don't believe in machinery that operates without a power source. The first night it happened, I nearly fell out of my cot. The sound was so loud, it felt like it was inside my skull. A low, mournful groan that vibrated the floorboards and made the windows rattle in their frames. It was the classic two-tone blast of a decommissioned station. I checked my watch, 3 a.m. The second night I was ready. I sat in the compressor room with a high-powered flashlight and a digital decibel meter. I wanted to catch the vibration, to find the logical explanation. Maybe it was a resonance in the old plumbing, or a freak wind tunnel effect through the Victorian-era vents. At exactly 3 a.m. the sound hit. It was deafening. My decibel meter spiked and then went blank, overwhelmed by the sheer pressure of the noise. But here's the thing, the compressors didn't move. The belts were still. The pressure gauges stayed at 0. The sound wasn't coming from the machines, it was coming from the air itself. I walked out onto the gallery, the cold salt spray hitting my face. The fog was so thick I couldn't see the railing 3 feet in front of me. I waited for the second blast, my hands gripping the cold iron. When it came, it nearly knocked me off my feet. But it was the silence afterward that was worse. In the 3-second gap between the blasts, I heard the answer. From deep out in the channel, miles past the reef where no ship would ever dare to sit in this weather, a sound came back. It wasn't an echo, it was a voice. It was a low, booming imitation of the foghorn, but it had a wet, vocal quality to it, like a human trying to mimic a machine through a throat full of seawater. It was a rhythmic, 3-note call that carried over the waves, vibrating the very marrow of my bones. I spent the next day stripping the housing off the horn assembly at the top of the tower. I needed to see the internal diaphragm. I expected to find a speaker system or some kind of prank left behind by a previous maintenance crew. What I found was a thick, black substance coating the inside of the brass trumpets. It looked like organic matter, baleen or some kind of heavy cartilage that had grown over the metal. It was warm to the touch. I haven't slept since. Last night I didn't stay in the house. I took my flashlight and climbed the tower, determined to see what was making that sound out in the water. When the horn blasted at 3 a.m., I looked out into the blackness of the Atlantic. In the brief flash of the automated beacon, I saw them. Hundreds of them, pale, elongated shapes floating just beneath the surface of the water, all facing the lighthouse. They weren't whales, they weren't seals. They were positioned in a perfect circle around the shoal, their mouths open, waiting for the next vibration. I'm leaving on the morning supply boat. I don't care about the archives, I don't care about my contract. If the compressors are disconnected and the tanks are empty, what is providing the air for that horn? And more importantly, why did the voice from the water sound like it was getting closer to the shore with every blast? Why did I find a pile of dead deep-sea fish on the gallery floor this morning, all with their eardrums ruptured from the inside out? Story 3. The Gallery Prince. Needlepoint Station is a skeleton tower, a spindly iron tripod bolted into a submerged reef 5 miles off the coast. It's not a cozy stone lighthouse. It's a vibrating, whistling cage of rusted steel that stands 150 feet above the Atlantic. I was sent there to check the structural bolts after a nor'easter. When you're up on the gallery, that narrow iron walkway surrounding the light, there is nothing between you and a cold, watery grave except a waist-high railing and your own sense of balance. The wind up there doesn't just blow, it screams through the iron lattice, a constant, punishing force that makes your ears bleed. I had been on the station for 3 days, living in the cramped living quarters suspended halfway up the tower. On the 4th morning, I climbed the internal spiral ladder to the lantern room to check the glass seals. The storm had passed, leaving the air brittle and the ocean a churning mass of gray foam. I stepped out onto the gallery to inspect the exterior rivets, and that's when I saw them. Scattered across the wet iron floor were barefoot prints. I stopped dead. I'm the only person on this station. The supply boat isn't due for another week, and the emergency radio is in my pocket. I looked at the prints. They were small, like a child's, but the toes were unnaturally long, and the arches were completely flat. They were wet, fresh, and steaming slightly in the cold morning air. They started at the north side of the railing, circled the entire gallery 3 times, and then stopped abruptly right at the edge of the east-facing drop. I didn't panic. I'm a structural engineer. I look for mechanical failures, not ghosts. My first thought was that a stowaway had climbed the tower. I drew my heavy inspection wrench and did a sweep of the entire station. I checked the battery room, the winch deck, and the hollow legs of the tripod. I looked into the galley and the sleeping bunks. I was alone. There are no ladders on the outside of Needle Point, and the splash zone at the base is a 60-foot wall of vertical, slime-coated iron. No human being could climb that, especially not barefoot in the middle of a gale. I went back to the gallery to take photos of the prints for my report. I figured maybe a large seabird had landed and left some kind of anomalous marking, but when I knelt down, I noticed the impossible detail. The prints weren't made of seawater. They were made of a thick, translucent slime, a biological mucus that smelled like rotting kelp and old copper. And as I watched, the prints started to move. Not the liquid itself, but the shape. The indentations in the iron were deepening, as if the weight of whatever made them was still there, pressing down with invisible feet. I stood up and backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. The iron floor began to groan, not from the wind, but from a concentrated weight moving toward me. I could hear the wet, rhythmic slap of skin on metal, but the gallery was empty. There was nothing but the gray sky and the screaming wind. I bolted back inside the lantern room and slammed the heavy iron door, throwing the deadbolts. I spent the rest of the day looking out through the thick glass of the light. Every few hours, a new set of prints would appear on the exterior of the glass. Wet, webbed handprints reaching up from the railing, sliding slowly across the panes as if something was pulling itself up from the abyss. The glass is 2 inches thick, designed to withstand hurricane-force waves, but I could hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of long fingernails against the surface. I'm sitting in the battery room now with the lights off. I can hear the scratching moving down the tower toward the living quarters. If the station is a closed system and the only entrance is a hatch I bolted from the inside, how did the mucus from those prints get onto the inner side of the glass? Why did I find a single translucent scale the size of a dinner plate stuck to the bottom of my own bunk this evening? The wind is picking up again, but it doesn't sound like the wind anymore. It sounds like someone is wet breathing through the vents. Story 4. The Bleeding Logbook. I didn't write those words. I know my own handwriting. I did not sit down at the mahogany desk in the watchroom of Grey Rock Light and pen those entries. I was sent to the station to digitize the historical records, a quiet, lonely job that should have taken 3 weeks. I'm a librarian by trade. I deal in paper, ink, and chronology. I don't believe in the supernatural, and I certainly don't believe in a book that can write itself. But every time I open the 1894 logbook, there is a new line of text, and the ink is still wet. The first time it happened, I thought I was experiencing some kind of sleep deprivation hallucination. I had spent 12 hours scanning pages of weather reports and oil consumption logs. I closed the heavy, leather-bound book at midnight and went to my bunk. When I returned at 6 in the morning, the book was open to a blank page at the very end. In a hand that looked exactly like mine, a single sentence was written. The wind is turning and the salt is heavy today. It was a mundane observation, but I live alone on this rock. There are no other keepers. There is no one else with access to this room. I tried to be rational. I thought maybe I was sleepwalking, or perhaps the stress of the isolation was triggering some kind of fugue state. I set up a motion-activated camera pointed directly at the desk. I wanted proof. The second night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the kitchen, 2 floors below, drinking black coffee and watching the live feed on my laptop. The room stayed empty. The book didn't move. The door remained locked. But when the sun broke over the horizon, I checked the book. There was a new paragraph. It described in excruciating detail the exact dream I had been having while I dozed off in the kitchen chair, a dream about a woman standing on the gallery railing, her hair made of tangled seaweed. That's when I noticed the smell. It didn't smell like the iron gall ink used in the 19th century. It smelled like a butcher shop. I touched the letters, and my finger came away stained a deep, visceral crimson. It wasn't ink, it was fresh, oxygenated blood. It was soaking into the thick, cream-colored paper, spreading through the fibers like a wound. I looked at the spine of the book, and I saw the impossible detail. The leather wasn't just old and cracked, it was porous. It was sweating a thick, dark ichor that pooled on the desk, staining the wood a permanent, rusted brown. I tried to burn it. I took the logbook out to the incinerator behind the keeper's house. I doused it in kerosene and struck a match. The fire roared, but the paper didn't char. The flames licked at the leather, and instead of smoke, the book released a sound, a low, rattling cough, like a man clearing his throat of fluid. The kerosene burned off, leaving the book cold and untouched, but the blood on the pages had turned black and crusty, like a scab. I'm back in the watchroom now, and the book is back on the desk. I didn't bring it back inside. I left it in the ash at the bottom of the incinerator, but when I walked into the room 5 minutes ago, it was lying open to the very last page. There is a new entry. It's only 3 words long, and the blood is still dripping off the bottom of the page, hitting the floor with a rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It says, "Look behind you." I haven't turned around yet. I can feel the temperature in the room dropping, and the air smells like the inside of a copper pipe. Why did the logbook mention the woman with the seaweed hair if I'm the only person who saw her in my sleep? And why, when I look at my own reflection in the lantern glass, do I see a jagged, bleeding quill stuck behind my ear, a quill made from the sharpened rib of a human being? Story 5, The Spiral Stairs. The blueprints for North Point Light are very specific. It is a 120-foot masonry tower with exactly 184 cast iron steps winding in a tight spiral from the oil room to the lantern gallery. I know this because I've spent the last 6 days scraping lead paint off every single one of them. I'm a contractor, not a dreamer. I work with measurements, grit levels, and surface tension. I don't believe in architecture that shifts, and I certainly don't believe in a staircase that grows. But I've been trying to leave this tower for the last 2 hours, and I haven't reached the ground floor yet. I finished my shift at 5 p.m. I packed my brushes, capped my solvent, and started my descent. I counted the steps, as I always do. It's a habit that keeps the rhythm of the work. 1, 2, 3. I should have reached the heavy oak door at the base in less than 5 minutes, but when I reached step 184, I didn't find the mudroom. I found another landing, identical to the one I had just left, leading to another flight of iron stairs stretching down into the darkness. I thought I had simply miscounted. I'm tired. The fumes from the stripper can be disorienting, and the salt air makes everything feel heavy. I turned around and headed back up, intending to reset at the lantern room and start over. I climbed 184 steps. I pushed through the hatch. I stepped out onto the gallery, but the view wasn't the Atlantic Ocean. It was a forest. A dense, ancient canopy of pine and hemlock stretched out as far as the eye could see in every direction. There was no water, no reef, no coastline. Just an endless, suffocating sea of green. I didn't panic. I checked my GPS. It sat on the stone railing, pulsing a steady blue light, and it told me I was exactly where I was supposed to be, 5 miles off the coast of Maine. I looked down at the ground. 120 feet below, and I saw the impossible detail. The base of the lighthouse wasn't sitting on a granite reef, it was sitting on a bed of dry, white bones. Thousands of them, bleached by a sun that didn't feel warm, stacked in a perfect circle around the foundation. I went back inside and started to run down. I stopped counting. I just let my boots clang against the iron, the sound echoing up and down the hollow shaft of the tower. I've passed the middle gallery 6 times now. I know it's the same one because I left my lunch cooler on the bench there this morning. Every time I pass it, the cooler is older. The plastic is cracked, then yellowed, then crumbled into dust. The ham sandwich inside has turned to a black, petrified husk, and then to nothing at all. I'm sitting on step 412 now. The air is getting thinner, and the smell of the salt has been replaced by the scent of ozone and old, stagnant earth. I can hear someone else on the stairs. They are far below me, but they are climbing at the exact same pace that I am descending. Every time I stop, they stop. Every time I breathe, they breathe. But here's the thing that makes me want to scream. The sound of their footsteps isn't coming from below, it's coming from inside the wall. Why is the iron under my hand feeling soft, like skin? And why, when I look down into the center of the spiral, can I see my own face looking back up at me 40 flights down, with eyes that are nothing but empty, black holes? Story 6. The Flannan Twist. I didn't find a single drop of blood. I checked the heavy iron doors, the storm-proof shutters, and the crane at the landing stage. There were no marks of violence, no signs of a panicked exit. The 1900 disappearance of the 3 keepers from Elian Moor is famous for its mystery, but I wasn't there to solve a cold case. I was there to install the solar-powered rotation gear and finally shut the living quarters for good. The mystery isn't that they vanished, it's that they never left. The kitchen was exactly as the original search party described it, a chair knocked over, a meal left half-eaten on the table. But the reports from a century ago are wrong. They said there were 3 plates. When I walked into that room, there were 4. 4 places set, 4 bowls of cold petrified mutton, and 4 glasses of water. I'm a technician. I deal in hard data and electrical circuits. I don't believe in time slips or phantom guests. I figured a previous preservation crew had staged the room for a documentary and forgotten to clean up. I spent the day working on the lantern, the rhythmic ticking of the clockwork the only sound on the island. But when the sun began to dip, I went to the watch room to pull the old logbooks for the mainland archives. I opened the final volume, the one from December 1900. The entries were written in a sprawling, frantic hand, describing a storm that supposedly shook the very foundations of the rock. But the meteorological records from the mainland are clear. There was no storm that week. The sea was as flat as a mirror. I kept reading, and that's when I hit the impossible detail. The final entry wasn't written by the head keeper. It was written in my handwriting. The ink was a century old, faded to a dull brown, but the slant of the letters and the way I looped my Y's were unmistakable. It described the exact serial number of the solar inverter I had just installed in the lantern room. It mentioned the specific brand of coffee I had brought with me in my pack, and it ended with a line that made the air in the room turn to ice. The 4th man has finally arrived. We can go now. I checked the lockers in the sleeping quarters. They were supposed to be empty. But in the 4th bunk, tucked under a thin wool blanket, I found a pair of modern steel-toed boots, my boots. They were rusted, the leather rotted away by 100 years of salt air, but my name was still clearly embossed on the inside of the tongue. I'm standing on the landing stage now, waiting for the relief boat that isn't due for 3 days. The island is silent. There are no birds here, no seals on the rocks. But I can hear footsteps in the gallery above me, the heavy rhythmic tread of 4 men walking in a perfect circle. Why does the ocean look like it's frozen in time? And why, when I look at the lighthouse reflection in the water, am I wearing a heavy oilskin coat from the turn of the century? Story 7. The One Who Stays. I didn't see the boat leave. I checked the horizon every hour, tracking the swell and the whitecaps, but the relief vessel never appeared on the line. I'm a logistical coordinator for the Coast Guard. I understand schedules, fuel consumption, and maritime windows. I don't believe in ghost ships, and I certainly don't believe in a lighthouse that can detach itself from time. But I've been on this rock for 6 months, and my watch says I've only been here for 4 hours. I arrived for a standard 2-week rotation. The previous keeper, a man named Henderson, was standing on the pier when I jumped off the skiff. He didn't say a word, he just handed me the heavy brass keys and stepped onto the boat. I watched him pull away, his figure shrinking until he was just a black speck against the gray Atlantic. I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat down to start the logs. That was 4 hours ago. I know it was 4 hours ago because the coffee in the pot is still hot. I can see the steam rising in a thin, lazy ribbon. But when I looked out the window to check the weather, the pier was gone. Not destroyed by a storm, gone. The heavy concrete pilings, the iron ladder, the barnacle-crusted stones, all of it had been replaced by a sheer, vertical drop into a black abyss. There is no water below me. There is only a void that seems to hum with a low, sub-audible frequency. I tried to call the mainland. The radio is dead, but it isn't broken. When I opened the casing to check the wiring, I found the impossible detail. The interior of the radio wasn't filled with copper wires and circuit boards. It was packed with dry, yellowed straw and the mummified remains of a dozen seagulls. They were woven together in a perfect, intricate knot, their hollow eyes staring back at me through the mesh. I went to the sleeping quarters to find Henderson's personal effects, thinking he might have left a clue about why he was so eager to leave. I found his trunk at the foot of the bed. Inside there were dozens of journals, all of them filled with the same sentence, repeated thousands of times in a cramped, desperate script. The light must stay on so the stars don't see us. I turned to the final page of the last journal, and the handwriting changed. It became very messy. It described what I had for breakfast this morning, 3 eggs and a piece of burnt toast, and it was dated October 14th, 1942. I'm standing in the lantern room now. The light is rotating, the massive Fresnel lens casting a blinding white beam into the darkness. But the beam isn't hitting anything. There are no ships out there. There is no coastline. Every time the light sweeps past the window, it illuminates the void, and for a split second I can see them. Hundreds of lighthouses, identical to this one, floating in the blackness like glowing white teeth. I can feel my skin becoming cold and hard, the texture of weathered stone. Why is the shadow I'm casting on the wall 100 feet tall? And why, when I look at the brass clock on the mantel, is the second hand moving backward, while the reflection in the glass shows me a man who has been dead for 80 years? Story 8. Still burning. I didn't find a single working bulb in that gallery. I checked the fuel logs, the backup generators, and the disconnected power lines. Blackwood Reach has been dark for 20 years, a hollow concrete shell left to the gulls and the salt. I'm a salvage lead. I deal in scrap metal and mechanical failure. I don't believe in forever, and I certainly don't believe in a light that feeds on nothing. But the beam is currently cutting through the fog with enough intensity to blind a man, and the source isn't coming from the lamp. I had been sent to supervise the final dismantling of the Fresnel lens, a masterpiece of 19th century glass that was worth more than the island it sat on. But when I stepped off the skiff, the air around the lighthouse was humming. It wasn't the sound of an engine. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a heartbeat echoing through the stone. I climbed the 200 steps, my flashlight cutting through the thick, stagnant dust, and when I reached the lantern room, the white light was so bright it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I checked the rotation gears. They were rusted into a solid mass of iron. By every law of engineering, I know that lens should be stationary, but it was spinning faster than any lighthouse I've ever seen, and every 4 seconds, the brilliant white beam was eclipsed by a sickening rhythmic pulse of deep crimson. It wasn't a flicker, it was a throb, like blood being pumped through a vein. I looked into the heart of the lens to find the lamp, and that's when I hit the impossible detail. There was no bulb. Standing in the center of the focal point was a creature that defied every law of biology. It was a massive, pitch-black silhouette, easily 10 feet tall, fused into the very ironwork of the pedestal. It didn't have a face, only a single massive eye that occupied its entire torso, and that eye was pulsing with a vibrant, neon red light. Every time it throbbed, the white beam of the lighthouse turned to the color of an open wound. I tried to run, but the light hit me. For a split second, I wasn't in the lighthouse anymore. I was underwater, looking up at the base of the rock, and I could see that the lighthouse wasn't built on stone. It was built on the shell of something miles wide, something that had been waiting for the light to finally bring it to the surface. I'm back on the gallery now, huddled against the railing. The sun should have risen 3 hours ago, but the sky is still pitch black. The thing in the lens has turned. Its red pulse is getting faster now, vibrating the very marrow in my bones. I checked my boat. I checked my radio. I checked the horizon. There was nothing there. Why is the red light reflecting off the clouds if the moon is supposed to be white? And why, when I look at my own hands in the beam, are they starting to turn into the same black, jagged stone as the tower? There's something about the edge of the world that feels different, like the land is trying to tell you that you don't belong here, but the sea is too hungry to let you leave. The light at Blackwood Reach is still burning. It's been burning for 100 years without fuel, without a keeper, without a reason. And every 4 seconds, that red pulse keeps throbbing through the fog like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. If you found yourself standing in that lantern room, staring into that crimson eye, would you turn the light off, or would you stay and keep it burning? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If you want more stories from the dark, hit subscribe. The next light I follow might be the one that finds you.